Hey, I want to talk a little bit about a word that has entered our public discourse in recent years. I think probably on both sides of the Atlantic, although I've heard it more probably in the UK. Just to talk a bit about this word and some of the things around it. And the word is snowflakes. Now you'll notice in the title of this video I'm using it in inverted commas. The reason for that is because I don't tend to use the term myself. However, I do definitely have sympathies as to where the pejorative comes from, the logic behind that. So basically, snowflake is directed at particularly millennials who are seen as being overly sensitive, finding reasons to complain, and always trying to find hidden bigotry, very often where it doesn't even exist. I definitely think there is an aspect of my generation, of the millennial generation, and I always say it's not all millennials that... I mean, let's be clear here, a millennial is simply someone born between roughly 1984 and 1999. So that's pretty much everyone in the 30s, or a lot of people in the 30s and 20s. So that's the first thing. Let's not assume that the overly sensitive people that the snowflake pejorative is directed at represent all millennials. They don't. So that's just the first thing. I do think there is definitely a basis in the criticism, because we have seen the sort of pathetic positions that universities have taken in recent years. An example of this being Oxford University banning clapping. Now, ostensibly this is for consideration for students with anxiety issues, but what about blind students who may not know what the applause is being directed at? If any, they may not know the cue for that. So it's one of these ironic things where something that's supposed to make things better could actually make things worse. To me, that's just bizarre. Also, when people are looking for reasons to find a hidden bigotry that isn't there, this is something that is very much embodied by the regressive left, and it is one reason I loathe identity politics, because I think it fosters resentment, it fosters a situation where people can't have candid discussion about things because they're constantly hung up on, oh, will someone be offended by that? So that's where the charge of snowflakes comes from. But there is another side to this. With Brexit, we have seen a more toxic atmosphere in this country. We have seen a normalisation of words that would be in normal times seen as pretty extreme. You know, we see people casually being accused of treason. It's incredible actually there hasn't been more violence. There has been a little bit of unrest, and there's been death threats issued against public figures. I'm surprised there hasn't actually been more violence, given just how bitter sentiments are right now. So it's all very well to call people snowflakes, but that is the other side of it, where there is this normalization of extreme rhetoric. It's kind of like two extremes. On one hand, you have people who are too sensitive. On the other hand, there's people who think it's perfectly okay to just throw those sort of inflammatory terms around. Now, just for the record, I do think there is such a thing as treason, but I think that if you're making a charge like that, just like any loaded charge like racism or sexism, you need to have strong basis for it. Now, my line of thinking is, if someone is actively working for a hostile foreign state, that to me is treasonous. Maybe not in law, but certainly in intent, in motivation, in ideology. But you know, where is the middle ground here? Because we're seeing, on one hand, particularly in student unions, this overt sensitivity. Students going out of their way to find, oh, that's cultural appropriation, or that's racist, that's sexist, that's homophobic, and just, it's an obvious problem with overt sensitivity. And that's where the snowflake pejorative comes from. So I think there is, although I don't use it myself, I understand where it comes from. But I also think sometimes, as an example of this, I'm thinking of a thread I've just seen where someone took issue with the poster calling John Bercow a traitor, and they weren't being overly sensitive. They weren't saying, I want to remove your post, or you can't say something like that. They were simply challenging the person to back it up, and the person's response was, this is a snowflake free forum. So that's the sort of gutter dialogue that passes for debate nowadays. I think that public figures do have responsibility. Basically, I want a situation where people have candid, robust debate, and that to me is being blunt about things. But I also don't want a situation where people are dismissed as snowflakes because they have a different point of view, or because we're now going to the other extreme of saying that sensitivities have no place. Sensitivities actually do have a place in society in certain ways. I mean, I would suggest it is important to be sensitive around something like Grenville or Hillsborough, or something where, lives were destroyed, that sort of situation. The Daily Star recently had a report about the so-called comedian Roy Chubby Brown being banned from Swansea City Hall. They argued his act wasn't in keeping with their values. Now, the Daily Star's response was to brand them as Snowflake Council, but there are many people that support Roy Chubby Brown. There are many others, including myself, who see him as an obnoxious creep who just uses callousness in his humour. And it's ironic, some of those most vocal about accusing others of being snowflakes are pretty vocal when it comes to, for example, have a sense of humour, or they're actually overreacting, so maybe they're the snowflakes. You see, this is why those sort of labels get problematic, because the people who throw them around might find themselves then charged with it. And I do think there is some basis for the thinking behind it, people being too sensitive on politically incorrect issues, but I don't think we should totally dismiss sensitivity. There are certain circumstances where sensitivity does have a place. If, for example, the police are speaking to relatives of who've had a member of the family murdered, they're going to have to speak in sensitive ways. Dealing with tragedy, dealing with someone who's really suffered, dealing with someone suffering mental health problems, all those things do require sensitivity. And I don't think that's weakness. I don't think that's being a snowflake. Me personally, I try to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. There are people I dislike. There are people whose thinking I don't like. So I tend to just avoid them. I don't want anything to do with them. I don't see any need to have a dialogue with them. But like so many things, there is a need for balance here. We are seeing too much sensitivity, particularly in universities. And that's a very big problem, because it's shackling freedom of expression, it's shackling potential dissent, and it's not what universities are supposed to be, all under the guise of protecting feelings. That's wrong. I think it's wrong when we think of the transgender issue, that women can be punished. I read today about a woman who worked in a birthing group. It was like kind of giving women therapy about being comfortable during birth, and she got in hot water from the charity that she represents because she wrote on Facebook that only women can give birth. Now, this is just common sense, this is just a fact, but that was seen as insensitive to the trans community. So there are certain common sense issues like that need to be looked at, because that's where sensitivity actually becomes intolerant and totalitarian. But on the other hand, I don't think it should be normalised that people go around calling each other traitors because of their stance on Brexit. I don't think that sort of vitriol should be normalised. And I do think people have a responsibility in the words that they choose. I have sometimes been very outspoken. Personally, I'm prepared to back up anything I've said. I have been pretty outspoken on a number of issues, particularly around crime. But I personally, I feel I can back up the things I've said, and I'm prepared to do so. But I'm not sure that everyone who spouts out things like this is always prepared to back it up, or at least they're saying it's normal. That sort of rhetoric is normal. It's not. We all have responsibility. Let me know your thoughts.